a challenge to intersect and give some really strong critical analysis in 10 minutes or less. When, for someone like me, who's born and spent all my life in the state of Georgia in the United States, I currently live in Atlanta, you know, the birth home of Martin Luther King, the current home place of the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change, and in Atlanta, which right now is considered, if not the only one, the most progressive urban community in the southern region of this country. I think I actually sit in a little place of privilege, you know, when compared to women I work with who come from rural Georgia or around the rural South, or who are in other cities that are, one, not predominantly people of color in government and leadership and business like we are in Atlanta. And so there's still some challenges, because despite all of those, what sounds like privilege, even in Atlanta, Georgia, even in my state, when it comes to the prevalence of HIV and AIDS among women, black women are still somewhere between 85 and 90% of the epidemic. In my town, out of every 10 women living with HIV, nine of them are going to be African American, not even women of color, but all black. And then when you look nationally at HIV in the US, it also raises some questions of what the conundrum really is, because we are, as women, in terms of the population size, technically we're about 6% of the entire population in the United States, and we're roughly about 12 to 15% of the population of women in the United States. And still, we're over 60% of all the HIV in women in the United States. And so what is that? It's not that we're having any more, as I would say, kinky, aberrant, or crazy sex with too many partners like anybody else. It's just that there are issues around lifestyle, there are issues around race that both work for us and against us that I think we need to point out as well today, that we haven't even had conversations about. So I think I'm actually raising a conversational issue today, and I'm going to make a note to myself so that I make sure I raise that question right. Y'all, this is my third workshop. I've been up since 3, so if I start talking about, you know, things I said this morning, then that's just because I'm a little confused. But it's also all related. So when you start to look at the question of what would these drivers then be, right? If it's not just about behavior in terms of women acquiring HIV, if it's not just about behavior in terms of what are the increased vulnerabilities for women of color and black women in particular, because that's a key concern for us in the United States, especially in the South, then what are some of those other issues? For my organization, and I can give a little bit of history on that, in our 20 years, we started out at a time in the 80s when the only population of people we could look to address HIV and AIDS were gay white men. The models were made by and for men. There weren't any other women's organizations. We could look to the reproductive health and rights organizations, but they were not focused in any way on HIV and AIDS. And we're still really trying to work at that intersection to get the two different movements to find a place in between to overlap and find some strategies and solutions together. For us, it was important to put HIV and women in a larger framework. I was fortunate to be a part of the original formation of the National Black Women's Health Project, to work with people like Shula Koenig with the People's Decade for Human Rights Education, and help work with Loretta Ross in forming the National Center for Human Rights Education in the U.S., and then subsequently helping create Sister Song. One of the things we were really clear about is that all of the issues that we're addressing have some undercurrent and underlying layers, and that because of those layers, the issues that we're working on fit or go beyond reproductive rights, go beyond women's rights, and really fit into the larger framework of human rights. So we could take any specific issue, whether it's HIV, whether it's violence, whether it's poverty or homelessness, lack of opportunity in terms of education or economic self-sustainability, all within the categories of civil rights. Are we being treated equally? Political rights. Do we have political voice, face, and representation in our local, regional, and national governments? Economic rights. Are we accessing and having a system that's arranged so that we can not only earn equal pay for equal work, but that we can earn livable wages for the families that we have to manage? Our social rights, are we getting the access to health care and education and housing and all of the basic human needs that we have, so that if we can manage that, then we can get to some of these other harder, more social and behavioral looking issues? Culture, are we understanding where we come from, and are our rights, our cultural rights being, one, either upheld, respected, protected, or are we looking at how our own culture is actually diminishing our capacity to enjoy our full protection within the human rights framework? And then there's the sexual rights and the environmental issues as well. Well, if you look at all of that, then you start to really get a good picture of why, particularly for Black women and women of color, these two issues are bidirectionally impactful. We know that if a woman is in an abused situation, if she's in a violent condition, then the level of vulnerability to HIV goes up many times fold. And likewise, for a woman who is HIV positive, her vulnerabilities to violence are also increased many times fold. So where does all of that sit? And I come up with this word, supremacy. You know, we've got, first of all, this overarching condition, especially, well, no, I'll take it even bigger. It hadn't even been talked or written about, but this overarching supremacy of what I would call Western supremacy, right? That where the money lies, where the so-called progressive thinking lies, where the opportunities to create and instill change in other places comes from a particular mindset that in the North and in the West, we have more, therefore we know more, therefore we do more, and we tell you how to do it. And that supremacy means that in order for countries to consider themselves developed, in order for communities to consider themselves a part of the global community, that for those with the resources, we're expecting the rest of the world to meet our ideas of what that development and what that success looks like. So that's the Northern or the Western supremacy that permeates so much of this. But then there's that next level of male supremacy, where the fact of masculinities and male privilege engage or cause people to engage with each other in different ways. We were talking earlier about, and I can explain a little bit about an intervention that we currently do, working to cross-educate providers in domestic violence shelters, providers who do HIV education and sexual health education, and providers who do substance abuse and mental health recovery and treatment, because these three things are all extremely critical when we're talking about HIV in particular. And what's important about understanding that is that around male privilege, that not only are we subject to it, but we are complicit with it because it's a part of what we consider tradition and culture, and we're less likely to raise up against tradition and culture. If it's a policy issue, we sort of have a target there. If it's a funding issue, we sort of have a target there. If it's about access, we have a target there. But when we are accepting that this is who and how we are as a people, right, which is how the supremacy gets systematized, then the perpetrators of violence are actually and oftentimes assisted by the victims themselves, because we get socialized into thinking that this is how it's supposed to be. And I've met so many young women who are now HIV positive, who have been through so many abusive relationships, who finally one day, after sitting through an intervention and understanding what their rights were and what could be expected of them if they were able to have their own agency and their own identity and who they wanted to be, that they finally realized that, oh, it didn't have to be like this for all my life, or for my mother's life, or for my grandmother's life. And that's because there are just certain things that we have always come with and that we've always understood. Now, like I said originally, I come from the South, so it's not that difficult. My region of the country, we still live it out pretty much every day. And I also, I'm sure people have heard me say this at least twice today, I also even dig deeper and focus in on what is considered the Deep South, And that's a different construct for people who don't know. The southern United States is a geographic region. It's about 15 or 16 states across the South, from Texas all the way over, including the District of Columbia or Washington, D.C. The Deep South is something different because it goes way further than a geographical distinction. It does go into social, cultural, economic, political, and civil issues, which means we have engaged much larger human rights conditions than might be in existence in other parts of the country.